so much. I am so delighted to see all of you. So many of you were a part of this journey along the way, so yes, I'm delighted that you're here. And I think I'll just kick things off. I was going to wait a minute, but I think we're good in terms of chairs. Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Woo. So first of all, I wanted to say how grateful I am for this space.
Yeah.
Art, yes. Art Plus Literature Laboratory is it's an organization for the community, by the community, with the community about the arts. And that is exactly what my book is all about. So there could not be a more appropriate space for me to host this shebang. So I'm super grateful. And if you don't know, I wanted to take a minute to say something about Art Lit Lab. Literally, a little over 2 years ago, this was a rubble floor. There was nothing here. And now there is this whole breadth of programming. On the third floor, there's an amazing education room. There's all kinds of summer camps, classes for people of all ages, some of them with scholarships for people who need them. There's all kinds of performing and visual art exhibits ongoing here all of the time. So many opportunities, and again, a lot of what this place is about is helping everybody feel a part of the arts. And I think our culture is rather strange in the way in which it sidelines the arts as leisure activity instead of having it be core and central to our everyday. And then also helping us think a little bit about where the heck we're going and to feel good and powerful about it. And that's what this organization is about. So I love this place. It could also use new members. I would welcome more members and donations. Talk to me if you want to know more about this organization. But the arts can be sidelined financially. And unfortunately, Wisconsin is at the bottom of all states in terms of per capita support for the arts. So it's important that we think about how to support that because, as I'm about to tell you, I think the arts are how we live good now and how we're going to live better later. So it's important, yes. So show it some love if you can. And speaking of love, I wanted to say a little bit about the first word in my title, loving. Because that word was kind of a stretch for me. It pulled me out of my comfort zone. I'm an academically trained geographer, and geographers like to talk about political economy, we like to talk about resource scarcity, and we like to talk about history, and we like to talk about institutions. But love as a social force is not, we tend to think of it as personal, a little bit about nostalgia, sentimentality, and so, yeah, loving is not something I've spent a huge amount of time thinking about, and yet, over time, what happened is as I started to feel this strange attraction, which then developed into all kinds of feelings of fondness and excitement and respect and responsibility, and with the help of artists, began to inhabit these little bits and pieces of land that are all around us, many of them abused, and so much of which we don't even see. I began to realize that, in fact, these were feelings of love. So I wanted to start with that, and I think it's there's a lot more to be said about love as a social force, but that is sort of something to look forward to for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a few times. I want to talk to you about what the orphaning of space is, what the heck I'm talking about, and then the role of the arts in helping us be there. And the two things, and I'm super delighted to have some help in talking about these, but it's the way in which art can engage with science and technology and really reorient those processes, come up with new products, and infuse with excitement what science and technology is. And the other piece of the arts has to do with a kind of relationship building and pushing boundaries and pulling things and people and plants and animals into alliances that no one thought was possible, no one imagined before. The arts do amazing work in both those places, and I'm super delighted to have Lisa Beth Robinson, Kristen Teelking, and Lillian Sizemore, who are going to come and talk about their own amazing projects. It's lucky for you guys, it's a twofer, because I don't actually write about those projects in my book, so you get to enjoy those. And I'm also really excited the Murmur Collective is actually going to entertain us with Orphaned Space music. That's my joke on there. Finally, I'm especially super grateful that my dear friend and environmental writer Eric Ness is here. He's going to help me do a little emceeing after we do Q&A. And then also we have a party later, so we don't do that. Okay, so let me begin here with the reading. And also there's actually a total of 4 chairs right here and a chair right there. Yeah, so, and there may be some more chairs, there are more chairs in the back. I don't know, if we really run out of space, we can, anyway, let me know, I can stop if we want to find some chairs. John and I decided we'd chance making it across the marsh with somewhat dry feet. We'd been zigzagging our way through the scrubby woods, bypassing people's encampments, empty now in the colder weather, and walking over low hills, bulldozed piles of soft, soggy dirt. We ducked under low, spreading branches of magnificent oaks and struggled through thickets of buckthorn. In some places, brambles made it impossible to pass. We were now facing a reed canary grass-choked wetland, and though we could see ice over much of it, we weren't sure how much had thawed and how much water we'd encounter if the ice didn't hold us. It didn't hold. The marsh wasn't deep, but we went in over our ankles. By the time we made it across the boggy space to the vast, crumbling parking lot where we left a car, our boots were coated in mud, our feet swimming in wet grit. It was a bonding experience. Now we each knew what the other was made of. We were not afraid of some mud, brambles, or chance encounters with people without anywhere else to be, all of which is possible in spaces behind buildings, between highways, alongside stormwater-entrenched creeks, because that's where both of us wanted to be. At least, that's what I was thinking when I followed John across that marsh. Why I wanted to be there is the purpose of this book. Passing by empty lots, I watched plastic bags assembled flap at me and wonder what they're trying to say. I take note of the small broadleaf plantain and yellow cone-headed pineapple weed pushing up through the packed earth of a street terrace and wonder what story they are telling. My attention on these overlooked and disconnected spaces is, for me, part of the long-term exploration of environmental networks, the relationships connecting people and other beings and their environments, and the stories we tell to narrate those relationships into existence and maintain them over time. In many such spaces, our stories are just too simple. I think about the small patch of land between sidewalk and road that I cross every day as I leave my house. I'd spend some time there for a while, shunning grass and trying to coax along a variety of plants. Not weeding too much, but kicking back at any one particular plant that decided to make the place its own. I was in there palavering with the daylilies, coaxing them to move over, not sure who or what else for, but please, just share for Christ's sakes. And noting the path through them that the neighbors made on their way to the bus stop, its own kind of lily control. Maybe I should stop worrying about the lilies, I wondered. What else might happen in this space if I let it? Or what if I brought in some other things with their own ideas? Lurking under this conversation were the rules from the city. You can't grow too high, you might block visibility for traffic. No fencing or staking that might trip up folks making their way home in the dark. This space has a job to do. Separating the road and the sidewalk, a temporary holding space for snow, maybe trash bins. No idiosyncrasy should interfere with those primary functions. But despite that, under the radar, I was holding raves, inviting in the riffraff. That is, until the precarity of it all came to the fore, and in a day, the fruits of all my negotiations were buried deep in chunks of asphalt and concrete as the city rebuilt the road. Months later, city workers pulled off the concrete, laid topsoil, and spread grass seed. I believe it included 3 varieties of Kentucky bluegrass, 25% creeping red or chewings, fescue, and a couple improved varieties of the turf-type perennial, maybe ryegrass. Which is all well and good, but I was looking for a different conversation. And anyway, those intrepid lilies came roaring back. So I brought in some other things, a yarrow, a sedum or two, and we were at it again. I wondered, what might happen if I could cut a small notch in the concrete and let more rain run off? How tall is that redbud sprout going to get before the city cuts it down? For me, spaces like these put to work in the city beckon. So I go on in the book to describe the processes of orphaning that quite literally disappear spaces like these by keeping them ecologically and socially disconnected to keep those relationships simple. This takes effort. Like here, I'm talking about the fencing, channelizing, lighting, herbiciding, cementing. Brownfields are orphaned by the toxicity of their pollutants. I want us to think about what this purposeful disciplining of space in our infrastructure might cost us. Because I'm also talking about a psychic erasure. We literally do not recognize this space as Earth. Our culture normalizes so much land as a commodity, something anonymous and bought and sold, with infinite possible futures and no history. And it's an enormous amount of space. This is St. Paul. This atlas of urban expansion has mapped many cities around the world and noted the phenomenon of cities growing faster than their population, so they're rolling out across Earth. A lot of open space. What's also true, and this space includes the green right-of-ways, the terraces, but also substantial brownfields, and a whole kind of variety of spaces. And the other thing that comes clear when you start to look at these maps is that they're the uneven, or is the, sorry, there you go, is that there can be a lot of unevenness to the distribution. And I was looking at this last night and looked at and kind of cut this, but what really caught my interest is where you don't see so much yellow in this, which up in the top here, which happens to be the I-94 corridor. And when that corridor was built in the 1960s, the early 60s, it decimated predominantly black neighborhoods that it cut through. I think 1 in 8 black residents in St. Paul lost a home to that interstate's construction. Many of the businesses it displaced never reopened. And the people who do remain there suffer worse from issues like asthma because of exhaust and dust. So it isn't only the presence of these spaces, but it's their distribution, right, which tell us something, which tell us stories. And it's true that in the wake of COVID, and as cities struggle to contend with issues, many of them climate-related, but also financial, fiscal challenges of paying for infrastructure, these spaces are kind of coming into more of a conversation. And there's actually wonderful ideas around rethinking these spaces to do something about polluted stormwater, flooding, urban heat islands, lack of green space in neighborhoods, etc. But there's something more, and thinking about them just as a solution to the problems, I think this is the opportunity to think more creatively about these spaces and to also recognize ways in which they represent struggle. And again, through my work with artists, I came to understand these spaces almost like portals, each one an opportunity through which people like me can glimpse important history and relationships and potential for action. This seems like a good moment to actually specifically acknowledge my positioning vis-a-vis orphan space. That is a space that I can disappear by virtue of my privilege. I can afford to not see many of these orphan spaces. As I disappear it, I express my privilege because I am very well supported by infrastructure. It works for me, it works very well. I can give it little thought. But for some people and other beings, such space is front and center. It is a focus of their struggle, even survival. Orphan space is refuge for plants and animals, some of which have no place else to go. Many communities are focusing on orphan spaces as part of their efforts for cultural and food sovereignty. For people without homes, orphan spaces come into view out of necessity in their search for shelter. And of course, this disappearing of land, its treatment as anonymous, is also how we disappear people and their history. And here in Madison, we are surrounded and on orphan space and land taken violently from the Ho-Chunk and other First Nations. So when we question our privilege, we actually get to start to see new things. These bits and pieces of land around us stop being passive containers, and instead they become places with history, each one with a story to tell and a possible future, potential sites of new events and relationships. So what might happen if people like me bring these everyday spaces around us into focus and allow ourselves to feel gratitude for them and to let our imaginations work there? So really quickly, I want to share a couple of the artists that allowed me then to start answering that question. One of the people who was most inspirational to me is Mrill Laderman Ukeles. Based in New York, Ukeles developed a whole career around this notion of maintenance art, in which she challenged the distinction we make between the artist's labor of pure individual creation and the caretaking work, the maintenance, or as she put it, keeping the dust off the pure individual creation. So she did things like this: scrub the steps and floors and sidewalks outside galleries. She put on display the labor of cleaning and maintenance as a way to show how easily it is that so much of us disappear this critical labor. In her Manifesto for Maintenance Art, 1969, she wrote, "I am an artist, I am a woman, I am a wife, I am a mother, random order. I do a hell of a lot of washing, cleaning, cooking, renewing, supporting, preserving, etc. Also, up to now, separately, I do art. Now I will simply do these maintenance everyday things and flesh them up, exhibit them as art." So altogether, her work, which went on for decades, and she had a long-term residency with the New York Sanitation Department, her work was about challenging the distinction we make between the labor that's revered as this source of transcendence, i.e. art, and that which takes care of us, which provides us with what we depend on each day. We can afford to not see it, and certainly not pay for it, if it's taking care of us. That's the same move that allows us to separate some parts of Earth as maintenance space, ignored, and other land as sources of transcendence. It's set aside for vacations, revered not only from afar, but only for special occasions. So what might happen if we started approaching each of these workaday spaces out there as a possible source of transcendence? Little pieces of land as valued territory, connecting us to Earth and potential sites for new relationships and ideas, and for the struggle to remember better and imagine the future better. Speaking of struggle, another artist who inspired me and that I write about in the book is Jenea Sanchez, and I met her in Douglas, Arizona, where she told me about her work. She grew up along the US-Mexico border, and she remembers as a girl literally running back and forth fairly easily between her family households on different sides of the border. And over her lifetime, and she's a lot younger than I am, she's watched it become increasingly orphaned, militarized and characterized as a violent no man's land. So in response, she occupies. In this piece, she's weaving fabric from her mother and aunt who live on either sides of the fence, transforming this physical barrier into a warp on which she's weaving a tapestry of her family history and demonstrating her continued presence here. Her work is really refusing this disappearance of a space as without history and cultural legacy and meaning. So it's with the help of artists like Ukeles and Sanchez that I begin to understand what might happen in orphan space. Once we stop seeing them, then what? So in my book, I have 3 case studies, and I can't describe all of them, but I did want to set up, to kind of introduce Kristen and Lisa Beth, who are going to help me talk about how art can engage science and technology. I'm going to set them up by reading a little bit from chapter 3, in which I talk about the art science work of Frances Whitehead, who's an art professor in Chicago. Surrounded by sagging chain link fence, the corner lot rests quietly under its cracked and crumbling blanket of asphalt. Soil, accumulated over decades in the fissures and depressions, hosts pockets of plant assemblages: mare's tail, broadleaf plantain, prostate knotweed, crabgrass, dandelion. They are colonizing, their roots expanding the cracks, their growth and decay building up more organic matter and making soft landing spaces for new seeds blown in to take root. The occasional ragweed presents a taller flourish. This orphan space, somewhere in South Chicago, once hosted a gas station. And now, with the owner bankrupt and long gone, and in a neighborhood with low real estate pressure, it has remained here for decades, mostly quiet, in a slowly expanding conversation with weeds. Underneath the plants and the asphalt lie benzene, toluene, xylene, and ethylbenzene, all elements of hydrocarbon compounds from gasoline tank leaks and fuel spills. The chemicals are included in octane boosters like MTBE and BTEX. There is also diesel fuel, solvents, degreasers in varying concentrations and depths in the soil. These lenses of contaminants have existed here for decades, changing only if an underground flow of water shifts things around. Such a plot is a common sight. The fence, asphalt, cement islands, colonizing plants, and contaminated soil found at hundreds of thousands of closed gas stations, all nodes in a vast network enabling the culture and technology of the automobile. Shuttered gas stations are testament to a multifaceted and common story of small business owners and large oil and gas corporations, faulty fuel storage technology and offloaded economic risk, massive pollution of underground aquifers and drinking water supplies, and sweeping environmental regulations unevenly implemented. Along with inestimable costs of poisoned groundwater in blighted communities, federal, state, and local governments have spent billions over the past 4 decades chasing underground pollution from leaking gasoline storage tanks, with the associated costs driving many small gas station owners out of business and leading to many properties sitting abandoned for decades. It's a common sight, yes, but strangely out of focus given its ubiquity and the toxicity of what is underneath. I'm curious about the history here, what happened, and what kinds of ecologies and politics maintain this orphan. The lot has lain quietly for decades, the bankrupt owner long gone. The ownership defaulted to the city. The tank has been pulled, but the hydrocarbon molecules remain, lying heavy in the soil. Similar lots in other parts of town have been excavated and redeveloped, but not here. There's not a lot of money in this part of town for new development. An orphan gas station site in a low-income neighborhood is a place in hiatus. Connections stymied by regulation, legacies of racism, asphalt, pollution, chain link fence, all a process slowed to a crawl. Such sites are invisible to us partly as a function of their ubiquity and unremarkable nature, and partly because so much of what orphans them lies underground out of human sight. Still, things can happen here, only slowly, which is exactly where sculptor and School of the Art Institute of Chicago Professor Whitehead found a toehold. So, I met Frances Whitehead here at this site, which has been here like this for decades. She gave me a tour. And they had asked her to look into, she volunteered herself to the city and asked her sometime, convinced them that artists had something that they could use. This was a previous administration when there was actually an environmental department in the city of Chicago. And they said, well, we have this problem with these gas station sites that sit here forever. There isn't any money to redevelopment, that you can't dig and dump the problem because that just moves it elsewhere. Can plants do anything here? It turns out that not a lot of research had been done on horticultural plants and what's called phytoremediation, which is actually a process by which the microbes and plant roots dismantle pollutants. They actually take them apart over time so that they stop being toxic. And the research on this has stalled out for a number of reasons, but it doesn't make anybody money. Plants are cheap, and this process takes a long time. So there has not been that pressure to do this research, and especially on horticultural plants in cities. And one of the things that Frances also realized is that people in certain areas of town were suffering worse from this because they didn't have the redevelopment pressure, and so it was in cities where there was this potential to actually have you don't have plants that could do this cleanup work, but nobody had done the research, and so she has these great stories about connecting the soil guy and the roots guy and the plant guy and doing the research herself, which is what we're looking at here with her research plots. And she actually did it in a number of years. They identified 12 new plants, and these are plants that you and I might like to have around us in our yard, and hopefully we do actually. And now you know that they're doing some good work for you if you have anything in your soil like this. But that work of kind of taking this technology, which was out there and under-researched and underdeveloped, and particularly hadn't been applied to this kind of challenge for these people, she really reoriented the whole thing, and it was a process of just asking a lot of questions, and as she put it, not being afraid to ask the dumb questions. So anyway, with that introduction about art, science, technology, Lisa, Beth, and Kristen, maybe you can talk about your work. Woo!
Get back to Mrill's brilliant words. There's so much we could talk about, but we're going to keep it short. And we wanted to start out with something that actually Mrill brought to our attention when we first started talking about our interest in the ocean, that the ocean is kind of like the biggest orphaned space that we have. You know, when you look at an image of the ocean, you see the surface. And if you see a picture of the ocean, your eye goes to the horizon line. You're not really thinking about the complexity of what's under that surface. And just, the billions of things that are happening down there that affect our lives directly and the health of the planet. We felt that capturing a moment in time through the action of capturing a wave in a solid form, in our case glass, would kind of be a way for us to start to talk about this sort of love for the ocean that we've had and give us an ability to kind of give the ocean a voice and raise awareness about health concerns and other concerns about the ocean that are happening with climate change. We started with, let's go to the next one. So there's a mini example. We have some larger examples back there that you guys can handle later, although I noticed there's a crack in one of them, so just be careful with that one.
So one of the things we've learned is that it's best when you co-create. You want to work from the beginning of the project moving forward, and you want to do it with the artist and the scientist so that you're not working in service of each other, but you're designing together. And that's the way you come to more positive and more universal solutions. So what you're looking at is you're looking at a lunch meeting where a design is being improved on a napkin. What we wound up doing, the goal was to capture the wave with photogrammetry. So we were working with the Coastal Studies Institute in North Carolina. They were gracious and they said we could come for a week and play with one of their scientists. They kind of let him out of his duties for 4 days, turned out instead of 5. He worked with Bernie to design the rig that we used. We had 16 cameras. The targets that you see are for maritime archaeology, which is what photogrammetry is usually used for. What it does is it captures the data points on a surface of an object and lets you create a 3D representation of that object. And so our biggest challenge was the cameras itself and the technology, which is why it was a good thing we were working with John, because the cameras want to go to the farthest point. They want to see what's farthest away. And when you're trying to capture a surface of water which is shiny and moving, it's very difficult.
Yeah, so Mrill talked about relationships and how innovation can happen with people from different fields, especially in our particular interest, science and art. When people get together, new things happen. So we're all in there trying to solve the problem. We figured out sawdust would make the surface of the water opaque. We made it work. We were able to play with the toys that CSI had, so another really awesome thing that artists don't normally have access to. And John certainly never had anyone ask him to do a photogrammetric photograph of the surface of water. I mean, most people think these things are crazy, but he was open-minded enough and creative enough to work with us. He was able. We made it work. We had 2 digital images. That we were able to, 3-dimensional images that we then printed into plastic, which we used as a pattern for the glass castings.
And what's great is we can bring the art side, so we can take the things in the conversations that we're having with the scientists, make them accessible to everyone. In the way that Kristen and I work with glass, you can put information in the glass. So it becomes, the story becomes part of the artwork. It's a code world building of a narrative with objects that seduce you and then ask you to find more that becomes interesting. So this is kind of how it went. One of the things about the rig is that there were 16 cameras, because that's all we could write grants for. Every time we took an image, we all had to climb up there and get the SIM card, or the SIM cards, I don't know, memory cards.
The Bluetooth
Yeah,
technology.
we had to get the cards out of every camera. John, you can see on the top right, plugged them into the computer, took the data, put them back in. And so it was a really laborious process, especially when we were just trying to figure out how to capture it in the first place. We are running out of time.
We were told not to go beyond 7.
Well, what was really cool is that the technologies that we harnessed and discovered led to other technological discoveries and different ways of making the artwork. So it was a process that keeps turning and feeding and helping and building.
And we got one more slide. So
Yeah.
coming back to this idea of giving a voice to the ocean, which is kind of what we wanted to do. This is sort of one iteration of the installation. The waves are used as sort of the focal points for these installations. They can be customized, brought to different communities depending on the different needs. There will be sound elements that come out of each pedestal that are triggered by motion sensors when you walk by. There's people's voices, from children in Ireland playing on the beach to John talking about the energy, the wave energy that goes around Cape Hatteras.
To the ocean itself, we've got clips of oysters speaking to each other and feeding. So it's really a cooperative conversation. So the space might have been orphaned, but once you engage with it, it has a different identity. It really comes alive.
And Mrill's helped us so much to sort of have courage to kind of pursue some of these ideas and
Just
to
kind of
validate
them.
Yeah, the process, which sometimes you really get some weird looks, and the scientists do too.
Yeah, but
So-
they also get really excited because the way they work, they're not allowed to do these things. They think they're not allowed. So these collaborations make a space for everybody to participate. So thanks, Mrill.
Shortest presentation I'm sure either of you guys have ever done. I think if you get a chance to talk to Kristen or Lisa Beth later, though, you do have to ask them about that sawdust, because that did not come easy. Getting the surface of that wave to register on a camera is a really interesting story. So there's a lot to occupying Orphaned Space that's pretty messy. And some of this work can look deceptively simple once it's done. For years, I would be so frustrated when I gave talks like these because people would say, well, that looks really nice. Look at those beautiful waves, or this nice installation. And all of the work behind it would just kind of disappear. And I was frustrated. I was like, I'm not communicating very well about the type of creative but also disruptive work that's going on when you're building connections like this, the bending of the rules that are required to make some of this happen. First of all, hanging out in places like these, which are designed to disappear, go against the grain. It's out of the box, it can raise red flags, it can make people uncomfortable, it can even piss people off. It's edgy work and you have to be determined. After participating in projects like these and writing about them, I came to call this kind of work diplomacy. And that's not a peacemaking, meeting in the middle kind of diplomacy. That is instead bridge building work. That's the bravery to say the current way of doing things and the current collection of experts in the room may not be right. It's making space for other people and other ideas. that aren't being listened to. And it's a courage to pull in diverse actors. Some of those are not human, but really creating these sort of catalyzing these creative acts that wouldn't otherwise have been imagined or happened. So I'm going to read now from my 4th chapter just quickly. I should add, though, that in terms of this idea of diplomacy, I'm not saying that artists are the only ones, and there are actually many people in this room who I know practice diplomacy, but I think because artists are frequently in spaces bending rules and they're trained to kind of realize visions even if they're not right there handed on a plate, that kind of energy and willingness to kind of make connections is an extremely, it positions them well. Okay, so I'm reading from my 4th chapter here. I first met artist Lillian Ball in person when she picked me up in her Prius one July day in downtown New York City. She was on her way from her apartment in Tribeca to the site of her environmental art project, Water Wash ABC, in the Bronx. As I got into her car, I noticed right away the small, bright-eyed dachshund sitting in her lap. "This is Naya, daughter of Neptune," Lillian announced. The dog regarded me calmly and with way too much formality for me to consider putting out a hand in greeting. And besides, as Lillian stepped on the gas and moved into traffic, I became way too distracted by her driving to pay attention to anything inside the car. Over the next few days, as she showed me around the site and introduced me to some of the many people she was working with, I continued to struggle to keep up. She was always on the move. Driving, walking, moving items, showing me things, talking with people. It seemed she was never doing less than 3 things at once. She was in the middle of a very intense field season, she told me, putting into the ground a far more complicated installation than she'd ever attempted, balancing contractors, working with a private landowner and business person, applying for city and regional permits to install technologies never before attempted, and engaging youth workers and volunteers. It was also high summer, hot, and there were wetland plants, native grasses, and flowering plants, as well as small woody shrubs, all of which needed care and to get planted into the ground fast. What I eventually learned about the totality of all her work would take me a while to sort through. The variety of types of relationships involved in her project, for example, and her often surprising combinations of problem solving and apparent flights of fancy were initially a challenge to evaluate. It was tempting to try to partition her work and to focus on the practical nature and end result and consider the rest window dressing or personal idiosyncrasy. But eventually, thinking over the myriad unexpected twists and turns and diverse challenges in her project, I came to see her perpetual motion as generating a kind of atmosphere, one fostering new interactions and relationships. Inspired by Isabel Stenger's, I call this work diplomacy. Stenger's, who has, she is a philosopher, and she has tangled mightily with how, as humans, we can do a better job of embracing the world, the natural world, and the environment as a political project instead of some kind of optional add-on. She makes this argument that we need to see our lives as shaped not only by other humans, which is perhaps politics as we know it, but also by other sentient beings and non-sentient things. What makes us human is not ours, she wrote. It's the relation we are able to entertain with something that is not our creation. She argues that if we see things in our world relationally like this, it gives us a way we can speak for Earth, not as scientific experts or deep ecologists, but, and I quote, as spokespersons claiming that it is not our free opinions that matter, but what causes us to think and to object. We become humans who affirm that our freedom lies in our refusal to break this attachment. Humans who affirm our freedom lies in our refusal to break this attachment. This is why I wade through Isabel Stenger's just for lines like that. So these are a couple of views a little later on in the installation, but previous to the one that I started with. And just to give you a quick sense of how it works, the back of this warehouse here, there's a long pipe diverting stormwater from a parking lot on the other side of the warehouse. And before she did this installation, any rain coming off the streets and parking area in this part of the Bronx shot straight into the river, carrying auto grime, sediments, and other nastiness. With Lillian's design, the water runs into a rock-lined pool, which kind of slows everything down and dropping some of the sediment load, and then flows into the wetland where a range of different plants go to work remediating more of the pollutants. So people get to see a kind of performance when they walk down this curvy pathway to the platform, and when the water eventually percolates into the river, it's cleaned up and moving much more gently. So this model of the little wetland and the permeable pavement, which she actually helped develop the technology for, it's made out of recycled glass, and she was very keen that it had to work a certain way because she wanted a certain color in the pavement. But all of this is a model that can be used in many places to mitigate dirty water flowing off the streets and streams. And this is a huge problem in cities everywhere, runoff into our waterways, and in fact is the largest source of pollution for Long Island Sound. All these little paper cuts. But of course, underneath the model, realizing it in any one place is the diplomacy. And Lillian Ball engaged stormwater hydrologists and ecologists and city engineers to design this wetland that would hold up and do the job, and Hurricane Sandy came through and it withstood that. She worked with a contractor to develop this permeable pavement, which uses a some kind of plant-based polyurethane, I think, to hold it to the glass pieces together. And she also worked hard on a particular suite of plants. She actually drove the plant guy crazy. And connected to a special youth training program called Rocking the Boat, which helps kids get out on the river and learn urban environmental skills. The other thing is that this is on private land, and she worked with a landowner to open up this little green getaway in the Bronx, which is in a super industrialized area, and where the river is mostly invisible behind walls of warehouses. So it's that multi-dimensional relationship building that I think is really key work, and it can just disappear when you're enjoying how beautiful and spectacular a project is. So I want to appreciate that, which is why I came up with this notion of diplomacy. And as I say, it's like when we get to enjoy the products, these beautiful products, we can forget this. But to help speak about the beautiful project, Lillian Sizemore has a project to describe for us here.
So this past winter, I built a temporary walking labyrinth using recycled Christmas trees in Olbert Park. I wanted to address a COVID-stressed community facing post-holiday doldrums in the dead of winter, and offer an everyday opportunity to appreciate nature, and that included a strong educational component about how we use our natural resources. I knew I wanted to build in Olbert Beach Park, which is close to where I live. It looks like this most of the winter. I made an initial proposal in the fall of 2020, and ultimately the project wasn't commissioned until spring of 2021 by the Madison Arts Commission BLINK program, which specifically funds temporary artworks. The public art administrator helped me to coordinate a Zoom call with several key city officials. This clarified my assumptions and preconceptions. The call outlined what was possible, what was not possible, and ultimately where such an installation would be allowed under a temporary land use permit. So this is the open field that was offered at Olbert Beach Park. Despite its appearance as an empty frozen tundra, this is a highly managed park space. One particularly important aspect of this project is that the park does have a snow-plowed lighted parking lot, which would allow easy access for the public to get to the labyrinth. My biggest directive from the city was no turf damage. I could not dig in the ground, I could not mount any signs in the poles, and they insisted that a walking labyrinth should not show any tread wear. No paths in the grass, and if it got muddy, I was directed to close. There were concerns about mattresses being left and vandalism of some kind. So I needed to help the city officials envision what was possible and to open up their minds so that they could imagine this on their own. I invited them to the site and showed my drawings, and we talked about the logistics and ideas together. And the city officials offered some very useful feedback and support. I made a list of all the different agencies and people that I worked with. And I ran this list through a word cloud program, so you could see how many different levels of engagement were required to get the project to move forward. Factoring in all the behind-the-scenes work and the people, there was this, as Mrill was talking about, the non-human part of it, adding the outdoor conditions of unpredictable winter weather, below zero temperatures, ice, snow, lots of wind, and was also necessary to gear up in heavy snowsuits to withstand the hours of working outdoors. And I coordinated a hardy and dedicated crew of volunteers that helped me over a period of 2.5 months. One of the things I found out in that call was that I could not collect bulk trees from the city off the terraces when they pick up the trees from the terraces. But I had to engage directly with the individual citizens. That was a new fold in the project, so I coordinated a holiday tree drop-off for the month of January, and I invited the public to bring their trees to the location, and I had no idea what to expect. Keeping in mind, I was planning this a year ahead of a project install, so people had not even purchased or cut trees yet. This led to my engagement with local tree farmers and DAPCAP, which is Department of Agricultural Trade and Consumer Protection, and I learned more about the consumer and commercial supply chain. I learned there is an invasive pest that can be imported on trees purchased at big box stores, and that can infect Wisconsin's native forests. It's called elongate hemlock scale. So I was able to alert the public through my social media and press releases about shopping local. This is the staging area. And because we got so many trees, the staging area became part of the art installation. And this is an aerial view of the drop-off location right off the parking lot where it's plowed. And we had enough trees for a tree museum and to be able to build these woven windbreaks. The trees that normally would have been cast off to the side of the road or the terraces, I always find that so sad. And the trees have so much more to give. And the public thought so too. So people were so happy to donate to an art project and to give their well-loved tree a second life. And these trees from all the individual households were woven together to create this greater whole. In addition to being able to walk the labyrinth for contemplation, I wanted to create a space where friends could gather outdoors for communion and conversation, rest in nature and be surrounded by the heady scent of pine. And I named this area the living room. I really love all those women with their masks on coming out. So this is a labyrinth on opening day. It opened on January 30th, and hundreds of people came to the opening, including the mayor, and people used the labyrinth daily. However, in early February, we experienced an unexpected freeze-thaw cycle that caused slippery, icy paths and flooded the living room. I acted quickly to close the paths, and I had to figure out how to keep the labyrinth safe and accessible while balancing the city's concerns. People wanted to use the space. It was a clear and clear need and a desire had been established, and lots of folks just ignored the barriers and caution tape and walked anyway. One acceptable solution was laying down wood chips in the pathways to keep the slip factor at bay. So I had no budget, and my energy was flagging after this heavy push of construction. My art supplies at this point were large helpings of grit and determination, insistence, friendliness, and confidence. An associate at UW Arboretum was able to save the day with 4 dump trucks of free wood chips from their prairie restoration project. So together, he and I wood chipped the entire space in one day. We reopened for the remainder of the run to the satisfaction of the city and the public. The project allowed us to think about our age-old rituals of winter in a new way, how we use holiday trees, the effects of a warming climate on our local environment, and our deep need to engage with the natural world. I aligned the labyrinth to the winter sunset and with open view across the lake to the cityscape and the Capitol building. Walkers became participants in the larger landscape, all with very different reasons for attending. Most of these notions I'll never know. There were no official surveys. Occasionally, I had the pleasure of meeting people at the labyrinth who would thank me and share their motivations for walking. And I hope this installation helped us renew our commitment to protecting this sacred land, to care for our trees and our birds, animals, and water, like we would for our own family, because they are family too.
All right, so I'm going to read a few more paragraphs here, and then we will hurry. I had begun to understand that using prominence as a measure of success may be part of a suspect drive for mastery, or a security related to some kind of ultimate control over a good, balanced system. Instead, the stories that I share reveal how precarious caring for orphan space can be. Many of these projects don't last very long. Occupying, loving orphan space is risky. You don't know how or if it might be reciprocated. But examples abound of people working to care, stepping up to protect, connect, and build in orphan space. Each neighborhood and community faces its own set of challenges. There is no easy one-size-fits-all. There is no way around the need to engage with each orphan as a particular place and moment with its own history. I want to build our confidence in our gestures of caring for Earth, despite the precarity and the risk. Even short-term projects provide respite or solace or resources to someone or something for a short time. And they generate our seed bank of ideas. They help build the emotional flexibility for continuing to do the work. We can embrace failure. One thread connecting the stories that I tell in this book is that as people bring orphan space into focus, rejecting land as anonymous, uncomfortable histories can emerge. Issues of racial and environmental injustice surface in many of these stories, buried layers for which many are not always prepared. But as this work seeks to connect to local ecology and to honor history and memory, I saw opportunities for a reckoning. These are some of the ideas that have emerged so far from my travels in orphan space. What I hope translates is that giving a damn, even where no one else does, might just be normal. These projects involve the foregrounding of what sustains us, and also open doors for how we might honor and engage, and what we might gain from investing all the land around us with meaning and importance. The stories I share are also about more participation and control in public spaces, and to honor and practice an everyday politics in which we are all using our imaginations to build new relationships in more of the spaces around us as part of a journey to explore new facets of being dwellers, motivated by our collective love for Earth. Thank you. As I mentioned before, environmental writer and dear friend Eric Ness is going to help me out with a little Q&A. I'm going to hand things over to him.
I was lucky enough I was not affected by the supply chain issues. Got an earlier copy of the book, and just as a preface, I just want to say that, you know, as someone who has written about leaking underground storage tanks, about floodwaters, about stormwater, it was a real privilege to have my brain folded around these issues in a different way. And I think those of you who are looking forward to reading this book will not be in any way disappointed. And I look forward, because as a journalist, you're my friend, I can't really quote you, but I want to be able to write about these ideas, because I think this is a really important thing. I had pulled out a couple of quotes from what I was able to see, and it was kind of funny because you read. Because I want to say, it's great, it's like Mrill's in the room. Read it. So she talked about, you know, we're going to get to the party. Well, remember when Mrill was talking about working in her terrace and trying to figure out what the city had planted there, and she was looking for a different kind of conversation. That's where the party actually begins here. We want to have a conversation, talk about this. I'm going to start with a question, which is simply, I've had the privilege of being with you in kind of the opposite of Orphaned Spaces. Boundary Water, there's the Wisconsin River, and I'm wondering how your interest and love for those places, which I've seen manifest, informed the development of this idea, and how the idea of Orphaned Spaces is going to turn around and affect the way you think about the wilderness, which I know has really helped form your brain.
Yeah, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay if I don't use the mic? Okay, I'll try to broadcast. I do not have a set answer for that question. That is a juicy one. You know, I think I was very fortunate. I grew up in a family in the West. We spent a lot of time outside. My dad was one of the early members of the Sierra Club, that actual employee. He was the first representative in the Southwest for the Sierra Club, so it was very early days. And I just was outside all the time. And I think what that gave me is a sense of just being in a situation where you're surrounded by things that are not like you. You know, I was human, but most of what was around me was not human. And that is an interesting sensibility, and one that I actually could imagine feeling even in a city. Once I started to focus on Orphaned Space, once I started, my attention got pulled in. And perhaps some of that had to do with the fact that I married a Midwesterner who loves the Midwest, and this is where I found myself at one point in our lives together. And so, you know, being comfortable here was just what was going on. So I was in not a huge city, and we're very fortunate. We have lots of spaces around. But coming out of that, I think it was like, well, you know, I know there's actually probably a lot going on here. So, and sure enough, we start slowing down and paying attention. And then, you know, I'm an environmental writer like you, so I'm kind of curious about what's going on. So all those stories, but I think it was that expectation that the world's a big, complicated place, and it ain't just human, right? So even where we are, there's so much going on that's not human. And it's yeah.
Well, I'm just remembering sort of the early days of our friendship, and we had kind of this notion of the Midwest as kind of a lot of Orphaned Space. Any questions? Anyone want to?
Hi. Beautiful talk. My first thought when I was like listening to your work was thinking about when you're a child, like when you see an orphan space, how that looks like a robot or like an island or like a planet and all of those things. And so I guess my question to you is, how did, or were you able to tap into like a childlike idea when writing this, when you think about orphan spaces?
You know, I think that's right on in one way, and that is, like Eric was saying, I mean, I grew up, you know, just hanging out outside, right, and playing around in the desert outside my home in Tucson, Arizona. And one of the things about, and I can't remember who writes about this, but I think it might be Gary Nabhan, who has a wonderful book, I think, called The Geography of Childhood. It's beautiful. And I think one of the things that Gary writes about is the way in which the children he's hanging out with aren't looking big, they become incredibly fascinated with this thing that is in front of them, and it becomes multidimensional. There is so much going on there. And, you know, when I talk about the culminated pineapple weed that I noticed, I mean, this is literally where my love for this began. I was like, I literally noticed that. And I was like, hey man, how you doing? You know, and so it is those, you know, like seeing an individual plant, a tiny thing, you know, and I don't know, you know, pineapple weed smells like pineapple. They're amazing. So anyway, there's just all this cool stuff. And yeah, so maybe there was something that kind of originated, and it was that resonance between the way children can, you know, explore space. That was the same. Yeah.
And to build on that, there's also this tendency of us not letting people, I mean, the places that I used to play and enjoy and explore the most as a kid are now places that we don't let kids go anymore. Garber, for example. You know, that was like, I mean, how many were kids here who played around Garber? Right. And how many were told not to play around Garber? Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm just a little curious. There's two words that I would have thought I would have heard in all the presentations, and that's land art. And I see this work very much fitting within an expanded idea of art activity within the land and the field or whatever. So I was wondering if that's a history that is sort of out of the way for you, or you didn't see it as part of it, or I just was surprised I haven't heard that phrase.
Yeah, so in the book I write, although...
Could you repeat that? We didn't hear it.
Oh yeah, sorry, it was a question about land art. And that it was something that one might expect in a talk about environmental art, you know, where's the land art? And so...
Well, it is part of land art, or activity of land art.
There is some fascinating history, I think, of spiral jetty, and I mean, there's a whole breadth, and I'm not an art historian, so there's this whole kind of, I can't do justice to the diversity, but there's this tradition of people doing really interesting work in the environment where they're specifically playing with things like light and time and other elements of the environment to kind of make these incredibly beautiful, arresting things. And out of that, many different things have happened, and I think of land art as something that kind of was in the 60s when it really started, and I know it's been ongoing, but there's a whole breadth. I mean, maybe you know Andy Goldsworthy, different kind of environmental artists, but it's just this huge, rich field. I spent a lot of my time hanging out with artists who were talking about, were heavy on the relationship end of things, in terms of sort of saying, really interested in the kinds of, not so much what they might make with the environment, but what might happen if they were in the environment. And there's also a whole conversation there about, I think, doing something good, solving a problem. So all the artists I talk to, and their technologies are often around that. So the creation of that wetland, the reorientation of phytoremediation in order to deal with pollutants, the reorientation of a stormwater basin, which I write about in the final chapter, was really about how art functions as it's solving problems that all of us are facing. And so there's it's continuing another conversation in the arts about getting the heck out of the gallery and being in the world. So it's very much a thread in there, and I think there's a whole, good talk around that, but, that's it. But thank you for the question, yeah.
Bernie, do you want to say something about that? I just have this very vivid memory, like almost 30 years ago, the bike path.
Me too.
But where that library repository, the Historic Society Library Repository building is, coming across this funky earthworks of like,
With the
yeah,
materials that were there.
Yeah.
I lived, a few hundred feet away, and I saw that space, that orphan space. I love orphan spaces as well, and yeah, I made a sculpture. Drill art, yeah.
all that stuff is still there, man. It could actually really use.
Yeah, so it was along the bike path, and Bernie had, I think you took chunks of concrete and boulders that were there, right? You didn't bring them
Railroad
in,
ties.
but
Railroad ties.
formed this, this man, right? It was a Sisyphus, but he was climbing up the bank, up from the bike path. It looked exactly like Sisyphus climbing, continually pushing a rock.
There was a tree that went in his arms, that terraced the space above it, and just took
Yeah.
advantage of what was perfect.
How long did that take you?
That was too long, and I didn't crush any fingers to make that.
Anyone else with a question?
Mrill, was there a part of you that was a little nervous about what if the concept is successful enough that people begin to also view those last remaining spaces as another opportunity to grab some more things, like to make them beautiful and bring them into making them accessible to only some of us? Like, is there a tension there between loving this for what it is and loving it for its potential and trying to find your headspace? maybe,
Yeah.
in those?
Yeah, awesome, right, yeah, spot on. So, and I do say this in the book. It is true that there are spaces, and Garber is one of them, that are pretty darn magical. But actually, I think if you look at the majority of these spaces, they are not. And for people, and that gas station is a prime example, for the people who are around it, it is not pleasant. So I feel like while there is the risk of everything getting tidied and cleaned up and sanitized and made into something else, that actually, there's a conversation where you want to try to leave space for things, to leave wild. This is actually a different conversation, and I don't think what I'm offering goes against that at all. I think what I'm saying is that when you have spaces of infrastructure that you rely on because they hold your stormwater, because they separate your street and sidewalk, because you plowed a highway through an area, you cut up these little bits and pieces of land. You therefore have a kind of responsibility. I mean, you created these things, and they tell us a story about what we've done in terms of the development. And as I say, the people who I followed into these spaces were there not to kind of celebrate the wildness and the craziness of it, but to solve problems. And so I think there are a huge diversity of orphan spaces, there's no question, but there's a huge need. And the last thing I guess I'd say about it is that just as Lillian was talking about how the city was like, don't damage the turf, this has to stay functioning this way, blah, blah, blah. For much of the infrastructure projects that I was part of, they had, these places had to continue to do what they were supposed to. They had to continue as maintenance space. So the stormwater basin had to continue to hold the water, even as it became, and this is my final case study, as it became a community garden and a natural playground, and there was an overlook, and they had all kinds of programming, and they grew all kinds of prairie plants in there that no stormwater hydrologists ever thought could survive a flooding. But in fact, all kinds of things could happen in that stormwater basin once an artist got in there and started asking dumb questions. So, and again, for the people around it, it's just this vast, empty, windswept space. So I think that might be part of it, is that some of these, orphans are maintained, they're policed, surveilled, cleaned up, they're disconnected constantly by policing in order to do some work. But they could really be imagined differently if we, yeah. So.
Colin, I'm wondering if that question comes from your experience with dam removal, and if, to get back to that, the thing that I started with, how does this orphan space idea connect to the kinds of transformations we see with dam removals?
Well, a little bit, I guess actually, because you have some of these restoration projects that happen, in areas where the transformation impacts the same group of people that were before seen impacted. But in areas where, like in urban areas, like dam removals in Milwaukee, right, created opportunities and spaces that, strangely enough, you brought up a different point. I was thinking they're our spaces, and then somebody comes in and sees the potential and suddenly becomes their space, right? Because they make it beautiful and no longer love. Mary, you said something different. You said, well, we sit here and romanticize orphan spaces. Other people are like, it's a disgusting and dangerous parking lot. So I didn't think about the other way, but I do think about urban renewal and urban revitalization sometimes in favor of the and I think that's what was being
Yeah, I think there's many orphan space is a big sloppy concept, really. And you have to be kind of careful with it, right? It's not gonna help guide a whole bunch of specific behaviors. It's an opening, it's a portal, and it's an opportunity to see a lot of space we don't think about. I think, there's much more to be said with urban planners and with people doing urban ecological restoration work and people who are trying to think about wild and city at the same time. So yeah, it's just the beginning of the conversation.
Just to add on to that too, one of the things that I love about your book so much and that you continually inspire me when I'm teaching to talk about this kind of space is that the act of noticing it and then that leads to sort of a desire to understand the space, and then that invisibility goes away because you can't unsee that, you can't not understand or say that you don't understand what's happening with how we kind of develop these areas. And I think even if nothing happens or gets beautified or even loved, and maybe it does, and that would be awesome, but just the fact that people are starting to notice things that become invisible because of our gentrification or whatever else, I think is maybe the most important part, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, I had the pleasure of seeing some of the work that Kristen's students have done, because she taught an environmental art class and gave them this notion of orphan space to work with, and of course they took it in all kinds of directions that I didn't see coming, including someone that took a series of photographs on roadkill. And many of them were kind of sort of just noticing, celebrating, decorating, mourning, but yeah.
And that's what we talked about, the act of recognizing naming is an act of love. It brings it into being.
Right. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so we talked about this in terms of space, but a lot of your examples and discussions are around different time scales coming in. These, and some of them are ephemeral, $1,000. I wonder if you could just sort of talk about the connection between space and time.
Is it maybe time to go get a glass of water? Yeah, Brian, thank you for that. Yeah, I might have to think about that in a while, because again, that's such a good question, and I don't know that I have, right off the top, any kind
That's
of.
the whole focus of the Chicago chapter. Slow.
Yeah, so, yeah, thank you. There is, right, there's all kinds of opportunities to look at how those things come together. I thought you were gonna ask me about place and space, which is one of those tricky geography-like questions, but, yeah, I don't know, I think, the other thing I was thinking of is how so much of this is about efficiency and having our lives work real good, and, our infrastructure disappears because it's really, a lot of this is about making us good efficient workers, and we get to work fast, and, nothing's in the way, and it's all safe, and, so a lot of this is kind of, I use the word slow a lot in that book because, Isabel Stengers actually uses the word slow as well in a different part of her writing, but where she is really sort of saying, this noticing, you can't do it fast. And so the very first thing you do is slow down, right? Before anything else, you just slow down. And then all these other kinds of things can flow out of that. And then, like you say, the slow cleanup, it's actually a gorgeous solution in that it doesn't cost anything, and it has this opportunity for supplying food to all these bees and potentially birds and having flowers, and all this stuff could have been going on for 25 years instead of it just sitting there, right? So, a couple of examples. Thank you.
Not to push you on the spot, but I was just overseas, and one of the things I've noticed is the lack of golden spaces, such as the landscaping that's done on exit ramps. And I always like to look at those here in the U.S. because you can tell the driver of the bulldozer was trying to make something nice, but it's sort of boring. And I was just wondering if you've run into people who were challenging bulldozed landscapes, or created to be nice by bulldozers, or if bulldozer drivers count as artists. Something like that.
Oh my God, I wish. I love that. But I can tell you, for example, that when Lillian, this is the same contractor who she worked with to create that permeable pavement, but she said to him, I love this guy because he is so good with backhoe. And he's just so sensitive. And she tucked him in between this little slip of a riverbank between the back of his warehouse and the Bronx River, and just scoped out these two things for the wetland. And so she literally just sort of called that out, So I do think that those machines, using them right there's the goal. So I don't know. The other thing is just that in those clover leaves, I think that's a huge open space screening for things to happen. And I heard a story recently, but I'm not going to remember the name of the museum, but there's a museum that was looking for a new home, and it's put together by a bunch of young people doing, I think, environmental related art, but and sort of hacker technology. But they had an opportunity to move into and create a new building, and then said, this is just going to create a just sort of gentrifying area, and we're not comfortable with all these. Anyway, they ended up in one of those clover leaf things, just putting their. So it's precisely because that's a space that was orphaned by them. So, yeah.
So to bring us on with the refreshments, I want to read a very short passage from the book that's very appropriate. Rhizodegradation, as noted, is the breakdown of organic contaminants in the soil by microbes. These soil microbes, which help plants by making nutrients in the soil available to them, are nurtured by plant root exudates, such as sugars and alcohols, because what better way to